I'd like to begin by saying that it seems very appropriate to be having this conversation with Steven in a city that I think of as being a city that takes food very seriously and has done for a long time. You have, of course, one of the most beautiful food markets of any city in Australia, as well as some wonderful markets, farmers' markets in places like Wollonga that are the envy of other parts of the country, I can say in a very heartfelt way. But also this is a city that has taken food scholarship in an academic context very seriously and in a very pioneering way for Australia. I also have to confess that I am guilty, like I assume many of you in the audience, of being the kind of foodie, or as Steven calls them, foodist, who buys too many cookbooks and likes to collect a few kitchen gadgets and, you know, thinks about holidays in terms of where I would like to eat. So we're going to explore and tease out some of the issues that we may all be guilty of in Steven's eyes around the book as well as in the book. So please join me in welcoming Steven Poole.
Thank you.
Steven, when I arrive in a place for the first time, I take all my kind of point of reference, if you like, about how a place works by going to find a market, because that tells me what grows there, what people eat, and it sort of gives me a kind of quick snapshot of a lot of things about a place that I'm interested in. Do you do that?
I was in Perth last week and I met a fellow British author who I hadn't met before called China Mieville. He's a great author of fantastical fiction. And I just explained briefly what my book was about, and he said, "Oh, great, because I hate food. And do you know what my most hated phrase in the English language is? Farmer's market." He really loathes that stuff. I'm not as hardcore as he is, but no, I don't go to a farmer's market. I tend to go to a cafe and drink a coffee and watch the world go by.
Well, I'm interested in that because the Anglo world seems to have woken up to coffee and developed a coffee fetish in the last 10 years. And I wondered whether you had a theory about that.
A theory about the coffee fetish? Well, you know, I love coffee and I'm a bit of a fetishist. And when I was researching this book, it turned out a lot of foodists, people obsessed with food, are fanatical anti-coffee people. And for me, that's how you tell a complete insane person. I mean, coffee is a miraculous bean. Who knows who had the first idea to roast it and grind it up and put it into a drink. But no, I love coffee. But it's funny now because everything has to be artisanal coffee. Everything has to be an independent coffee shop. There was actually a controversy in England a couple of weeks ago when in North London, Crouch Hill, very middle-class part of North London, there was this independent coffee shop called Harris and Hoole. Well, people thought it was independent. And then it turned out it was backed by a 49% stake held by Tesco, the giant supermarket. And a journalist from The Guardian went along and interviewed people, you know, who were really distressed and sad, said, "I thought this was an independent coffee shop and it isn't. I feel so abused and deceived." But on the other hand, you have to remember that back in the early 90s in London, you couldn't get a decent cup of coffee except for a couple of Italian places in Soho. And it's places like Starbucks, which now, of course, we're all encouraged to despise because they're horrible monster change. Those were the people who educated the British about coffee. So it's rather rich now to turn around and say, well, Starbucks are horrible and everything must be independent. Because, of course, if you start off independent and you're very successful, then you'll be a giant chain yourself.
Talking of ironies, though, I guess it's kind of ironic, isn't it, as well, that in a way, the audience for your book are the very people that you're kind of criticising. I mean, no one who's not interested in food is going to read this book.
Well, you say that, although my publishers were rather disappointed when they went to bookshops and found that this book had been shelved in the food section. Because, really, if you're the kind of person who goes straight to the food section in a bookshop, you may not like what I have to say.
Well, we will explore that a little bit more this morning. I'm glad also that you raised so early the word scandal and the word Tesco, because I thought that it would be interesting to get your take on the whole horse meat saga.
Ah, horse meat. Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, it turns out that for years English people have been eating horse when they've had frozen lasagnas or Swedish meatballs, horses mixed in with everything. And there's been a rather shocking sanctimony in some of the foodists' reactions. I mean, a lot of my book is about the moralism of foodists and the way they despise the lower orders who eat what they consider junk. So when it turned out that there'd been horse mixed in with our beef, there were some food writers and restaurant critics on Twitter who were saying, oh, well, it serves those people right for eating frozen lasagna in the first place. I would never touch such garbage. And that makes me slightly uncomfortable. And basically, it's just a labelling issue, isn't it? I mean, if it had said horse on the packet, people probably would have been prepared to pay more because it sounds more exotic, because we don't ordinarily eat horse in England. And so I went on the Today programme on Radio 4 to talk about this, and I gently suggested that maybe some people's lives are constrained such that they have to work 2 jobs or just very long hours, because all the middle-class foodists were saying, well, the way to get around the horse meat scandal is you go to your organic local butcher, don't you? You go to your organic local butcher and he educates you about the life of the cow you're planning to eat for dinner. You know, this cow was called Colin, and his hobbies were making daisy chains and playing a tiny flute. And then you feel good about the steak you're going to fry. But a lot of people don't have a local organic butcher if they live in deprived inner city areas, or there is a butcher but it closes before they get home from work. So I just said, okay, maybe people are mentally and physically exhausted at the end of the day, and if they want to throw something in their microwave, who are we to criticize them? And then there's a Twitter feed for replying to what's been on the Today programme on Radio 4, and very soon after my slot finished, I looked it up. And there was a stream of people saying, oh, well, these people are just lazy and stupid, aren't they? I mean, that's ridiculous. I can knock up meals for a week in 30 seconds flat. These people who don't know how to do that, of course, they're perfectly prepared to slouch in front of the TV for an hour, but they can't be bothered to cook. And again, this appalling snobbery.
I wonder about that. If you look at that from the point of view of, say, the French, who have eaten horse meat traditionally for a long, long time, largely because I think it was meat that didn't get maggoty as quickly as beef.
Is
so
that right?
that there was a sort of a practicality to it, as there is with so many French things. And traditionally, steak tartare was always made of horse meat. You lived in Paris for 5 years.
I did.
I was just wondering whether you could say how your perspective on food was changed or sort of heightened by those 5 years in France.
I generally got more interested in having not just any old steak, but a good steak. And I enjoyed, but I mean, I ate basically sort of classic bog standard bistro dishes. I didn't go out to sort of gastronomic meccas. So it's just about the food scene in France seems a lot more democratic. There doesn't seem to be this dichotomy between the foodists on the one hand and the unwashed lower classes on the other. I mean, the postman goes to the local bistro and eats the same thing as everyone else, and has a little flask of wine with his lunch, and it all seems very civilized.
So that's what I was getting at, was that it seemed to me that maybe there was more balance in the attitude to food as a kind of holistic part of life in French culture, and I wondered why that is.
I couldn't tell you because I'm not French, but I mean it's true. They don't make a fetish out of it like we do. It seems. I mean they have haute cuisine. They invented it's a French term, and they have lots of famous French chefs in history. But there's something. I mean there's even something pretentious in the English language about calling yourself a chef. I think because in French chef just means boss. So if you're the chef de cuisine, it just means you're the person who runs the kitchen. But people in England calling themselves chef and wanting to be addressed as chef strikes me as already slightly pretentious. So I'm careful in my book just to call them cooks.
Well, let's talk about another term that might also be somewhat pretentious and is one of my pet peeves, and that's the degustation menu.
Degustation.
The degustation, yeah, which has become a very fashionable thing and is a vehicle really for chefs to show off and to charge a lot of money and to keep you in their restaurants sometimes for interminable periods of time. I think some degustation menus take between 4 and 5 hours to consume, and you don't get out of the restaurant before midnight. Can you talk a little bit about, do you have a theory about why the degustation has kind of come to the point it's come to?
It's in essence, it seems to me, it's the cook's special effects showreel to advertise his wares. I went to one of these horrendous places in London to research the book. It was a place called Viajante, and it's run by a cook who used to study under Ferran Adrià, who's a very famous Spanish chef. So it was all this molecular cuisine, and we had things like a tiny piece of roasted celeriac served on a warm stone with a little blob of foam next to it. And I was looking at my notes the next day when I was writing up, and my notes actually said they described this dish as roasted celeriac with shaving foam. That's what it tasted like. If you're shaving, you get a bit of citrus-scented Gillette in your mouth. That's what it was like. And of course, everything was served on stones and in beakers and chopping boards. Nobody serves anything on plates anymore. But yeah, this was a 15-course blizzard of tiny dishes that were either weird or deliberately surprising. So they give you something that looks like an apricot, and it turns out to be just a ball of olive oil that's been flash frozen with liquid nitrogen. And so your mouth's full of oil. That's quite disgusting. Anyway, and yeah, it took about 3 hours to get through all this stuff, and I paid for a friend who'd helped me with the book, and the bill was over £200. So it's not something I would do every day, or even ever again, actually, if I could help it.
I think one of the things that to me highlights potentially the kind of decadence that we may have reached in society, another thing that I think is a bit of a pet peeve, is designer dog food and designer baby food.
Is that a thing now? Interesting.
Well, someone told me the other day that you can get liver meringues.
What is that?
Well, it's egg white beaten together with a little bit of liver to give your dog, a tasty treat.
Wow.
So do you think, dog food, pet food has become fetishized again. We're sort of enhancing it and giving it a kind of almost human quality in the way it's described on the packaging. And baby food is also now sort of going through the same.
Well, that is shocking. I suppose if you're a militant foodist, you need everyone in your household to be a foodist. Otherwise, there might be somebody, cocking a skeptical eyebrow at your obscene habits. So there is something. Apparently, foodie children are the new fashion accessory in Brooklyn. I read something about that while I was researching the book. So people, oh yes, well Tarquin, he's only 3 and he's already a big fan of pig's ear. You have to get them young. You have to inculcate them into this strange cult. It's like making you're forcing your child to become a Scientologist, I guess.
One of the things that's on the rise, talking about children developing their palates early, is food intolerances. People who have gluten intolerance, lactose intolerance. We didn't really see any of this 15 years ago. What do you think is going on there?
There's a lot more of them around. They've become a kind of fashion. If you read, as I sadly had to, these optimum nutrition Bibles by people self-described as nutritionists. By the way, in England, you can call yourself a nutritionist while having no qualifications whatsoever. It's not a protected term. They say they deliberately cloud the distinction between food allergies and food intolerances. And while there is a small section of the population who, for actual biological reasons, can't digest gluten, they can't drink milk because they don't have the lactase enzyme, more and more people are going gluten-free who probably don't have celiac disease because it's become a fashion. The tennis player Djokovic attributes his success to going gluten-free, so apparently it helps you become more athletic. I don't know, I accidentally bought some gluten-free bread once in the supermarket just a couple of months ago, and it tasted like rubber. It was horrible. But, for people who actually can't tolerate it, fine, but it's a small example of what I talk about in the book, which is orthorexia. This is allegedly a new kind of eating disorder that some Italian psychologists have proposed, and it's from the Greek orthos, meaning correct. So more and more people have this idea that getting obsessed with eating only what is optimally nutritious and correct for your body. So you'll buy all the superfoods and the strange berries and the seaweeds. And of course it's very antisocial because these people, if they're invited round to dinner, they can't eat what they're served. They have to get out their little pouch of strange things and eat that instead. But the idea seems to be that if only you eat correctly, you'll have complete control of your fate and you'll never get sick. And of course that's nonsense, but you can see why it's a comforting illusion.
And I guess that's also part of the impulse for the organic movement, which you are particularly scathing about. I think that's one of the most powerful sections and one of the most provocative sections of your book. But you're also very scathing about the whole locavore movement. Would you like to talk a little bit about the complexities and paradoxes and contradictions inherent in the whole locavore?
Yeah, it's an interesting, again, it's a trend. The trend, eating local is the best thing we can possibly do. It's the most ethical thing for our community. Isn't it wonderful? Go down to the farmer's market and shake the hand of the person who grew your apples, and it's all lovely and wonderful. But then I was put onto this line of thought by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who talks about this in one of his books. And he says, okay, that's all nice for you, but then think about the poor Kenyan farmer who's growing green beans, and he wants to sell them internationally because there's not enough of a domestic market for his product. Well, if we're all clapping ourselves on the back and congratulating ourselves on only eating beans that are sold locally, we're refusing to buy his beans. And he's so unimaginably, for us, poor. He's so poor that even a tiny bit of extra money would make the difference to him between being able to send his children to school or not. So from that more global perspective, eating local looks a bit like a self-congratulatory clique. We're kind of a gated community. We're all right, Jack. And the rest of the world's problems can go hang. And also, even for farmers, I was doing an event about this down in Albany last week. And there was a local sheep farmer who made the very good point that, it's all very well for you guys to say eating local is the best thing, but I want to sell 1,800 sheep in the spring. Are you all going to buy 10 sheep each? No. So I have to send some of them further than that.
The other thing that's become a very sort of romantic notion amongst foodies is the idea of foraging and going for a walk and sort of picking your own wild fennel and various other greens from well, not from the side of the road, but from a little bit way back from the side of the road. Can you talk a little bit about your point of view on foraging and how you distinguish between, say, foraging and dumpster diving?
Well, there's a big strand in foodism in general of, getting a little thrill out of pretending to be a peasant, and foraging plugs into that. There's a wonderful passage in the new novel by Lawrence Norfolk, the British novelist, which is a novel set around food. It's about an orphan who grows up in the 17th century to become the chief cook of this grand lord's house. And there's a passage in it, there's nothing to eat one winter. And so the characters have to scrabble around in the snow for chestnuts and cobble together some really disgusting chestnut bread because they're desperate. That's all there is. And of course a foodist now would look at that and say, hyper-local foraging, how marvellous. But foraging is the new trend. You have this cook, René Redzepi, allegedly the world's greatest cook now. He has this restaurant called Noma in Copenhagen. And it rather takes the shine off it when you realise he doesn't actually go out and forage all the food for his restaurant himself. He has an army of like 15 professional foragers who go out and collect all the twigs and leaves he's going to put on your plate and charge you millions of pounds for. He actually came over to London to do a pop-up at Harrods. And one of the dishes, somebody who was there described it to me as being lettuce leaves with live ants crawling all over them. Apparently the live ants taste quite lemony, they're quite nice, but sadly there were blobs of salad cream on the lettuce too, so some of the ants got their legs stuck, and they were like sadly waving their antennae, waiting for their doom. Anyway, so foraging, it's ridiculous. And as I argue in the book, the real foraging, as you mentioned, in our society is done by people who really don't have enough to eat. And they forage in dumpsters. They go around the back of the supermarket when it's chucking out time and, they try to rescue some food that otherwise is going to be thrown away. And the obscene thing is that supermarkets, some of them actually deliberately spoil that food so that can't happen, even though after it's just going to be thrown away afterwards. So it's another sort of class thing of foraging. I don't know. I've never done any foraging. Somebody was telling me the other day that he wades out into the water and catches crabs with a net, and he caught 15 last night. And that's great if you live by the seaside and you can catch crabs. Those crabs sound delicious, but in the middle of London, what is there to forage? I suppose snails. That's about it.
Do you have any food taboos? I mean, is there anything that you wouldn't eat or that you consider to be, there's a lot of... there's a strong relationship between food and repulsion and our fear of decay and how symbolic that is of death. So is there anything that you have a food taboo about?
There's nothing that I've refused to eat, and I'm not really a fan of offal. I mean, offal, the fashionability of offal now is another instance of, the French phrase is nostalgie de la boue, and it's about pretending to be a peasant and, going back to working class food. And in the mid-90s, because cook Fergus Henderson started serving brains on toast and, tripe in a restaurant called St. John, and it became wonderfully fashionable again. But of course, it had been elaborated and become a food fashion, so working class people still couldn't afford to eat it. Whereas once, that was what they ate because that's all they had. So I'm not a huge fan of offal. The only things I absolutely won't eat are Brussels sprouts, actually, because it turns out that I'm what's called a super taster. about 25% of the population, they have some extra wiring in their taste buds, and they can taste a chemical in Brussels sprouts which actually makes them want to hurl. And that's how I feel about Brussels sprouts. But otherwise, I'll try anything once.
Kind of ironic, again, isn't it, that you should turn out to be a super taster?
I know, isn't it dreadful?
Do you have a theory? I heard this statistic. I've heard this several times from cookery book publishers, and I find it completely astonishing. Apparently, the average number of recipes that people use in a cookbook, for which they may have paid between $40 and, sometimes over $100, is 2. 2 recipes per cookbook. I'm sure that's not true of most people in this audience, but apparently on average that is the case. Do you have a theory about what it is we're doing when we're buying those books, and then what's happening when we only use 2 recipes?
Well, as someone who doesn't buy cookbooks, I can't be sure. They did another survey recently where if someone has 10 cookbooks, it's likely that about 6 or 7 will never have been used to cook from at all. Cookbooks, they seem to be a species of pornographic fantasy literature. It's a kind of escapism. You buy the cookbook because you see Nigella on the cover in her perfect kitchen with the sunlight coming in gently through the muslin windows, and you say, well, I want that lifestyle. I want that perfect kitchen and the ideal domestic setup. So you buy it as a kind of dream, and you can read it and salivate over the stuff and imagine what it'd be like to cook this food, but then, of course, one can't really be bothered.
Well, you've brought up food and sex, and one of the most entertaining chapters in your book is about food and sex. So would you like to talk a little bit more about the way we have put these 2 things together now inextricably to create gastro-porn, and what a huge appetite there is for that?
There's a massive hunger for it. Yeah, well, you get Nigella chucking custard on her face and then licking it off rather suggestively, and Jamie Oliver calls pretty much every ingredient sexy, or this is a sexy little pasta, this is a sexy roast chicken. And Marco Pierre White, one of the first wave of celebrity chefs in the 90s, says to me, a lobster is more beautiful than most women. It's strange. People seem to have got their wiring mixed up. He still boils the lobsters alive, of course, so he's not that sentimental. But yeah, of course, sex and eroticism and food, there's a link, there's oral pleasures are multifarious and so forth, but we've kind of fetishized it to the extent where it's a kind of pornography rather than eroticism now. And there's a wonderful review by Alexander Cockburn in the 70s where I think he coined the term gastro-porn, at least I couldn't find an earlier use. And he's reviewing a cookbook by one of the new wave of French chefs doing nouvelle cuisine, and he goes through saying how structurally similar this cookbook text is to a sex manual. There's the same, if you follow these steps and do precisely what I say, then you will have this wonderful pleasure at the end. And of course, food photography then started being very artsified and very artificial, because if you see something that looks delicious in a cookbook, probably half of it is made out of wax, because it would have melted by the time if they'd used real food. So I mean, again, it's like airbrushing pornographic images. So it's all a fantasy.
Let's come back to the reality then for a moment and talk a little bit about obesity, which is another very kind of major preoccupation here. We've overtaken the US recently as the fattest nation on earth, which is not
really?
something
Congratulations.
to be proud of. So fat tax, you in favour?
I don't go into obesity in my book because I consider it a different topic, and it's very political and people get very upset about it. The problem I have with suggestions like, we're talking about it in England I think already as well, a tax on calories. Again, I mean, who's that hurting? It's hurting the poor. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing. They've introduced a minimum unit price for alcohol in Scotland, and they're now threatening to do it in England as well. And people on very low incomes have tough lives, and if they want to have a drink in the evening, who are we to say, well, you shouldn't, and we're going to make it more expensive, so we're going to, if you want to carry on drinking the same, we're going to make your life just a little bit harder, and you should be thankful for it. And I just think that's a nasty way to proceed, so I would have the same reaction to to taxing calories as well.
You say that you don't deal with obesity in the book, but you do say food is the last ingestible substance you can indulge in without being frowned on, and I think that that's no longer true.
Well, it's true if you're eating foodist stuff. This is the problem. You're frowned on if you're eating vast quantities of McDonald's and other so-called junk food. But if you're going out to Michelin-starred restaurants every day or eating degustation menus and you put on a few extra pounds around your waistline, nobody's going to criticize you for that. So again, it is a kind of class thing. And by the way, I'd like to stand up for the processed food, as I do in the book. People say, oh, processed food is horrible. It's got chemicals in it. Chemicals are all there is in everything. So your lovely organic food is made up of chemicals too. And B, processing, well, when you fry meat, the chemical changes in the meat are extremely complex. Everything we do to food is processing it so it's easier to eat, or in fact so that it doesn't kill you, because some things are poisonous in their raw form and then you cook them and they become palatable. And the advent of food processing, which everyone said, oh, terrible, industrial food processing, our food got more complicated. But they started processing food because in the 19th century, food was so unreliable. It was often so adulterated. So your coffee might have been coloured with manure, and your flour might have been half plaster. So they started making processed food under the royal seals in England so that you would actually know what you were getting. So Hovis bread was one of the earliest examples. And even now, a processed ready meal in the supermarket, I think, well, it's division of labour is good, isn't it? Because I'm happy to eat it because food scientists, mad experts in the laboratory, have figured out what to put in this. And I'm confident that it won't kill me. So I don't really care what's in it that much. I'd rather devote my intellectual energies to something else.
I remember being shocked when I read that when Dr. Johnson first drank chocolate in the coffee houses of London, it was actually coloured and thickened with brick dust because they didn't know how to separate the fats from the solids correctly. And so to make the texture more appealing, they just put brick dust in it. One of the most popular diets in the world at the moment is a British diet, the fasting diet. And I wondered what your...
That's crazy, isn't it? Is that one where you just don't eat for 3 days?
Yes, it's the one that's been endorsed recently by Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who's just lost a considerable amount of weight on it. And the idea is that you fast for 2 days of the week, not completely, in that you lower your calorie intake to 600 calories a day. And while the mechanics of it are not really what I wanted to ask you about, it seems, again, just to go back to this sort of obesity epidemic, that we're all overeating in the Western and developed world. We're eating probably 30% more than we need to keep alive, and it's having serious impacts on our health and on public health budgets. So I was just wondering what you thought about the idea of it becoming a trend to perhaps fast.
Well, fad diets, to a penny, there's always another one around the corner. There's the paleo diet where you pretend you're a hunter-gatherer and you just eat nuts and berries and meat. And there's, the traditional Japanese diet. I mean, they're all, but everybody, fad diet's not the answer because everybody already knows actually how to lose weight. It's very simple. You just eat less and exercise more. Or as Michael Pollan, the food writer, says, but he puts it, eat food, mostly plants, not too much, and do some physical exercise, and that's how you lose weight. So, the fad diet is, an attractive shortcut, it seems to me. People latch on to whatever the Dukan diet is another one. I don't know what all these things are. But, I think it gives people the sense of having some sort of control over their eating habits in their lives, but in a way that isn't as boring as, the sensible advice just to eat less and exercise more. There's seems to be a new consensus developing actually that a lot of the problem is sugar. So I reviewed a book for The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, quite interestingly, which was about how fructose, which is added to virtually everything in America, is the root cause of the obesity epidemic. It's very interesting about how it went through the sort of hormonal interactions and how chemicals enter the body, and it seems that fructose is okay if you're eating fiber with it. So eating fruit is good, but drinking fruit juice, all the cellulose has been destroyed, so that the fructose is more harmful. So actually drinking fruit juice is as bad as drinking Coca-Cola, this guy says. So, and he's, funnily enough, he spends his entire book saying, well, the old wisdom that you should eat less and exercise more, that's not the answer, and blah, 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 fructose, fructose, fructose. And in the end, what is his advice? It is eat less fructose and exercise more. So it's more or less the same thing.
I'm glad you mentioned Michael Pollan because I wasn't sure whether you sort of were in favour or not in favour of him in your book. You say at one stage, though, that the literary and visual rhetoric of food has become decoupled from any reasonable concern for nutrition and the environment. And I would have thought that Michael Pollan does make that connection with the environment and with nutrition in the omnivorous dilemma.
He's someone who's an exception, and the politics of the plate is the catchphrase that Michael Pollan's books produced. But there's something, he goes too far the other way in my mind. He goes into this weird kind of new age pseudo-spiritualism, which I just find really weird. So at some point, at the end of one of his books, maybe the Omnivores Dilemma or In Defense of Food, he says, "And isn't it wonderful, we're all part of this giant food chain, we and the animals and the farmers and the producers, and we're all rooted in the soil." And I thought, hang on, I look down and move my feet a bit. No, I'm not actually rooted in the soil. I can get up and walk about. I'm not a vegetable. It is this kind of strange eco-mysticism which causes a slight allergic reaction to me as well. And also one of the heroes of his book is this farmer, this local farmer who's all into this sort of deep concern for the environment. Splendid. I love the environment too. But then at some point Michael Pollan asked him the quite pertinent question, so it's all very nice, your organic local farming practices, but we couldn't actually feed New York City just doing what you do, even if we turned all the land into farmland, could we? And the farmer says, no, but what is the point of New York City anyway? What use is it? And so it tends towards this rather excessively misanthropic idea. And of course, living in cities is very ecological. You know, it saves energy compared to the same population more spread out over the land. So these questions are just more complicated than they might seem at first.
There's someone that you mentioned in the book that I've never heard of, and I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about him this morning. You described someone called Stephen Gates as a food adventurer. Who's that?
All I know about him is that I heard him on the radio. He is a food adventurer, and he does funny things with food. He says, oh yeah, I went to the butcher's and ordered 10 kilos of bull's testicles, and he turns food into sort of games for children. And he sounds like a very happy and amusing man. But again, there's this kind of authoritarianism. He says, my aim is just to make people think more about food. I say, well, do I have to? I mean, there are other things I like thinking about. Do we all have to think more about food? Do we all have to spend 5 hours thinking about food and preparing food every day? Can't we use ready meals sometimes if we're feeling a bit bored and tired? Can't we read a book that's not about food? It's just the kind of monomania of the food culture is something I don't really like.
One of the things that, of course, we've introduced into the food equation to kind of spice it up in terms of television and entertainment anyway, is competition. Can you talk a little bit about those sorts of TV shows and the twinning of those two things?
Well, one thing about foodism in general in our culture seems to me that it's a culture of competitive eating. In America, they have these shows of competitive eating where, one guy says, I'm going to eat a bicycle, and the other guy says, oh, I'm going to eat a car, and I'm going to eat a spaceship, and, ridiculous feats of stuffing things down your gullet. But in general, I mean, foodists are all about, I know about arancinis better than you do, and I can identify the authentic version of this exotic dish, and you don't. And it's all about, placing yourself in a hierarchy and being really looking over at what other people are eating and whether they're eating it correctly. So I think our whole culture, sadly, has turned something that's necessary into a weird competition. And that's reflected in the shows, of course. And of course, once you start watching them, as I grudgingly decided to when I was researching this book, you get hooked because they're reality TV shows and you like one of the contestants and you want him to win or you want her to win, and it becomes involving like any reality TV show. But in the end, it's no longer really about the food. But I hope this development will have jumped the shark, because Simon Cowell, the appalling man who's the impresario for Australian Idol and X Factor and all that, he's launching a new show in Britain called Food's Glorious Food. And that is, in the same way that X Factor was karaoke contest, this is a karaoke contest for cooking. So it's a cookery competition, and the grand prize is having some sum of cash and having your recipe with your face on it sold in a supermarket. So I think if he's getting into it, maybe everyone else will say, well, it's over now because we hate him so much. It's my fond hope.
I can feel the audience beginning to simmer in terms of having questions of your own. So just to let you know that I will be giving you plenty of time to ask questions, and there is a central microphone for you to go to in a couple of moments' time. Steven, one of the things that I do like very much about your book is that you, in a way, to kind of offset all these ridiculous sort of values around competitiveness that are completely unnatural sort of twins with food, and distort our relationship with food, you do remind us about the importance of conviviality.
Yeah.
And that actually what's important about a meal that we share is not the food on the table, but the sense that we're gathered together to celebrate each other and being in good company, and the way food facilitates and enables great conversation. So would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's just sad when a foodist is just staring down at their plate and thinking only about what's in, and then getting out their phone and photographing it, uploading it to Facebook, competitively say, hey, look what I'm eating. I bet you don't even know what it is. But instead of, people tell me that they go to dinner parties now and they're sort of much more anxious affairs because the host, bless them, is concerned about doing the food correctly. Even if it's some Jamie Oliver recipe, will I get it right? Will people hate me if I misroast the potatoes? I don't know how you could do that, but I suppose it's possible. Yeah, and conviviality, I think, is the great virtue that we should set against this weird fetishization of the food itself. And there's a great strand of it in actually old cookbooks. I discovered the first cookbook by Delia Smith is called How to Cheat at Cooking. And she says, even then in 1971, she said, there are too many, all this flood of television virtuosi and cookbooks make food seem terribly complicated. But food is all about conviviality. So here are some quick recipes, and you can cheat. You can cheat by using instant mash and just add a bit of butter to make it look like it's real mashed potato. And you can use a packet of onion sauce. It doesn't matter, because what she says, and this is wonderful, I think, what we lack in the kitchen, we can make up for in the dining room.
Yeah, that's great. I love the fact that you also mention in an aside in the book that she did the food for one of the covers of one of the Rolling Stones.
Let It Bleed, the album by the Rolling Stones, it has a fantastic cake on the cover, and that was Delia Smith. I didn't know that
I have great trouble sort of putting Delia Smith and the Rolling Stones together.
She's obviously more of a secret rocker than she lets on. But I have fond feelings for Delia because in the mid-90s my mother bought me Delia Smith's How to Cook 1 and 2. I think she was trying to send me some kind of message. It was the books that tell you literally how to boil an egg and how to make rice. And that's how I learned to do those things, so I'm very grateful to her.
And she's just announced her retirement and said that food on television has just become too much of a game show and too kind of trivial, and that she doesn't really want to be part of it.
Yeah, good for her. She doesn't want to concentrate on football, I think.
It does beg the question, are you a good cook?
No. I can cook a handful of things. My best dish is a roast chicken. I do that quite well.
Right.
But I don't cook a wide variety of stuff.
So if we were all coming round for dinner,
you'd get a great roast chicken.
Okay, fine. What do you make of the, again, this is another trend, and I'm sure you've noticed this and would have noticed this when you were researching the book, that increasingly people do go on holidays where they use the holiday as a sort of an opportunity to go to visit various gastronomic temples, or, for example, I've heard of people now going on truffling holidays where you can rent a pig or a dog and go and find your own truffle.
These people, can't they find something more productive to do with their time and money? Yeah, gastro-tourism. It's been going for millennia. I'd quote some Greek author, saying rather disapprovingly of another Greek author, well, this guy, it seemed to me, he just wanted to seek out over many continents whatever best pleased his own stomach. And there are people who do that to this day, and there was a horrendous article in I think it was in the Australian Gourmet magazine or Condé Nast Traveller, something like that, a couple of months ago. And the writer went to Peru, and he said the most amazing thing. He said, Peru is a great gastro destination now because the Peruvians have only lately discovered their own cuisine. And I was like, what? You mean they've been eating stuff for thousands of years and not even knowing what it was? Who knows what this is? I don't care. It's like, and then just a couple of years ago, they said, oh, this is a plant, and that's a bit of an animal. So it's a snobbish thing where the business class glossy magazine writer goes to some developing country and says, isn't it marvellous? They've just discovered their own cuisine, and they have these charmingly primitive kitchens, and, God knows how, but they somehow manage to cook up the most splendid meals.
But let's just go deeper with this for a moment. What do you really think this is all about? Is this symptomatic of a society that's searching for meaning and grasping at anything that reconnects them with nature and with a simpler way of life? What is really going on here?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, but another part, the more alarming part of it, is that it's conspicuous consumption, a phrase we know, but I mean, you're literally consuming. It's the apotheosis of that. And there's a kind of decadent individualism to it. But of course, it is the dream of, we feel we don't trust politicians, we don't trust priests. So in a way, the star cooks are the last people we trust, not only to tell us how to cook, but also how to live. That's the weirdness of it. So Jamie Oliver, who's done a great thing to improve school meals in Britain, but then people ask his opinions on educational policy, and I say, well, he's not really an expert in education. And his answer is, of course, well, you should teach everyone cooking. Forget classes in maths and science, they can learn about that through cooking, like making spaghetti into mathematical shapes. I don't know exactly what he had in mind, but obviously nothing actually very specific. We feel, and especially in urban communities, we want to feel this kind of idyll of being connected back to nature. I mean, I think that's behind a lot of the local eating thing. And it's a nice dream, but the way we're pursuing it seems a bit bizarre.
So what do you think we should be doing? Where should we be? What's the correction that you would like to see in terms of our priorities and the way we think about food?
Well, I try not to be as authoritarian as the foodists I'm criticising, because then I'd be committing the same sin. But I think there's room for us just to chill out a bit, and particularly not to be so invested emotionally in what other people are eating. Can't we all just eat what makes us happy and be satisfied with that?
So if you had to have a kind of 3-sentence mantra like Michael Pollan's "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants," what would your mantra be?
It would be eat food as long as it's not poisonous, and don't worry about what other people are eating. Live and let live.
Okay. Seems like an opportune time to throw this session open to you. So if you've got a question for Steven, please come to the microphone.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. I have a question. It's something that I've noticed when I first came here to Australia. Because back at my home, my family and I eat with chopsticks, so we don't have this ceremony or whatever you call it, that you have to put certain shapes of fork on one side, certain shapes of spoons on one side, and that sort of thing, which some people told me is the way they've been since the past, and somehow it helps the food taste better. But the way I see it is, if the food tastes better, if the food tastes good in the first place, it doesn't matter whether you're using it with a big fork or a small spoon, it will taste better, and vice versa. If the food doesn't taste good, no matter what you use, silverware or wooden spoon, it's still gonna taste bad.
Yeah.
So,
Do you have a question?
so what is your opinion on, why do people still insist on this systematic silverware or whatever?
It's a very good question. I'm entirely with you. Yeah, if it's good food, you can eat it with a plastic spork, and it'll still be great. It's a way of insisting on a hierarchy and a snobbery. So you're excluded if you don't know how to use these things. Famously in Britain, if you go to a sort of upper middle class dinner and you don't know which knife to use for your fish or for the butter, then you'll be really embarrassed. And there's no sense in it, as far as I understand. There's no reasoning to it. But B. Wilson has written a really nice book, actually, about the developments in kitchen technology, and she talks about all the changes in cutlery over the centuries. And the current sort of high-class cutlery thing with 8 different implements is quite old. And hundreds of years ago, people would carry around their own knife, and they'd just tear off a hunk of whatever it was at the table and stuff it into their mouths. And they seem to be having a good time as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Would you consider opening an exotic food chain that sells inorganic beef, inorganic cabbage, and milk with no chemicals?
It's a very good idea, yeah. I could call it Steve's chain of unfood. All the really sinful things that we're not supposed to eat. Food stuffed with chemicals. Yeah, inorganic, nasty, processed stuff.
I love the labelling of milk that now says permeate free when
What is a permeate?
permeate wasn't in the milk in the first place.
Ah, clever.
Or it's not a problem.
Yeah, they do actually label products gluten-free that never contain gluten anyway.
Or avocados that are cholesterol-free. They never had any cholesterol in them.
Yes.
So thank you for your suggestion. Do you have a question as well?
Yes, can I say one more thing?
Yes.
You can.
Having been lactose and gluten intolerant since forever, when those words weren't even among the general
Before it was trendy, good for you. Yeah.
I'd suggest that the commonness of these allergies and peanut allergies and various of the others, or intolerances also, are not only an indication of food faddism, but they're an indication of evolution in action.
No, yeah, possibly. Yeah. Because we evolved, those of us who have lactase, we evolved it over 10,000 years. Nobody had it in the first place, but people started drinking milk and eventually the body evolved a defense for it. So yeah, maybe that's happening. Because I hear that the incidence of celiac disease, which is the disorder that makes you gluten intolerant, that's going up and nobody really knows why at the moment.
Yes.
That's right. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to go back to your quick point about the Kenyan farmer who grows green beans and would do better if he could export to Europe. There's a lot of starvation in Africa, and so there is actually a market if those people had a decent life, and the African farmers could provide the food aid. But I know for US food aid is tied, the money is tied to making sure it comes from America. And so when all of that enormous amount of food that's taken in disasters is provided by the US, then the African farmers can't actually get a foot in to be able to sell their products. And so being local in a whole lot of higher level ways would actually help African farmers. And there has been research done some time ago about how African farmers are actually disadvantaged and lose their livelihood by not being able to sell for disasters and you know, when there's already bad things happening in the farming industry. I'd like your opinion on that.
That's a very good point. I mean, again, these questions become more and more complex the more things you consider. So, I mean, I just think we should try and think. I mean, it becomes a political question. It's no longer even about food, because we all know there's enough food to feed the world. We just have a distribution problem, and it's a serious problem.
Stephen, you mentioned control in relation to diets, I think. And I'm wondering whether you think that the control or the over-control that's exercised by a lot of our governments and regulators has resulted in foodies trying to exercise some control in their own individual lives.
To kind of take back the power from the states. That's an interesting way of looking at it, yeah, because I was talking to a food writer who was actually on this radio show with me, and she said about the horse meat scandal, and she said despairingly, you know, the problem with the UK regulatory agency is that they've been concentrating on safety above all else exclusively. And my reaction was, well, I'm glad they are. That means I can confidently eat stuff that's in the supermarket and know that it won't kill me. But yeah, she didn't like that. So yeah, it's a way. I guess it's a way of taking back control of your own life. But of course, you're not really in control. But if some people think they can somehow control their own destiny with what they put in their body, I mean, it's a lovely thought. But again, it's obviously not true, because sadly people fall sick or get run over by buses. So you know, good luck.
But it is food safety is something that I think in this country we take very much for granted. And when you look at the recent food safety scandals in China, you realise what the potential is for abuse and corruption, and how vulnerable a population is to being fed things that are really toxic and dangerous for them, and that they don't know anything about and feel utterly powerless to control.
Yeah, I'm very happy that we have the Food Standards Agency in Britain, which I believe has become, you know, manically focused on safety since we had the BSE scandal, which was a real scandal, unlike the horse meat scandal, just a labelling issue. The idea that, you know, cows, which are herbivores, the idea that you would feed them on mashed up brains of other cows, obviously wrong. And since that happened, I think, you know, our food has become much safer, and I'm glad of it.
Next question.
This is going back to the first question about cutlery, and it's really just a little story. the Australian Aboriginal actor David Gulpilil starred as a young man in a film called Walkabout, and shortly after the film was produced, he and other actors were taken to London and actually dined with the royal family. And he, being a bush Aboriginal, didn't have any idea about the cutlery, and so began to eat with his fingers. And to everyone's great delight, the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles and Princess Anne all ate with their fingers too.
Oh, good for them. That's nice.
Thank you. That's a lovely story. Stephen, it's been a while since you wrote the book, so I'm just wondering whether you found that people flooded you with crazy food anecdotes and food fads after you'd written the book, as so often happens with these sorts of books, that, you know, it's too late for you to include. And in fact, my radar, when I knew that I was going to be talking to you today, was sort of on hyper-vigilant alert, and I noticed that there was a restaurant in Tokyo that recently had a degustation menu which featured soil, earth, as one of its star ingredients in its hero dish.
Wow.
So
That's a good one.
have you come across other similar sillinesses?
Something I saw out in Fremantle just the other day in Perth. I went and had some fish and chips by the seafront, and it was very good fish and chips, and I saw a notice on the wall saying this restaurant is home to Australia's first fish and chip flavoured gelato. Awesome, fish and chip flavoured ice cream. I didn't actually taste it, but, you know, it sounds kind of ridiculous and low class, but then you think about it, Heston Blumenthal, the famous molecular gastronomist, he makes a dish called crab ice cream. So I think the Australians got there first, so well done.
There are quite a few people in the book that you do have. There are some people that you single out for more respect and more consideration in terms of their role in the foodie world. And I think one of the ones that comes off particularly well is Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah.
Can you say something about your sense of where he sits in the world and what makes him one of the saner spokespeople in that world?
I like Anthony Bourdain because I think he's a seriously good writer. His literary style is just brilliant. It's very exciting to read. And he's, you know, he's a kind of professional cook. He's a line cook in restaurants. You know, he didn't suddenly become a celebrity chef overnight. He's been cooking, and he talks about the camaraderie of the kitchen in a really exciting way. But also, you know, he's very skeptical about some of the weirder dreams of the fanatics. Like one of the organic fanatics in America, is it Alice Waters? So, you know, she was saying, you know, we've got to totally dismantle the industrial food industry, and it should be organic farms as far as the eye can see. And somebody asked her, well, what will poor people eat? And she said, oh, well, there are wonderful heirloom turnips, you know, and heritage cabbages, and they'll just do fine on those. And Anthony Bourdain is writing very skeptically about this. And then he says, you know, but, okay, so she wants everything to be backbreaking organic agriculture as far as you can see. Who's actually going to work these fields? If you put in mothballs all the machinery and all the industrial fertilizer and all that, where are all these millions of extra farmhands going to come from? And of course, you know, people don't think about that because they just imagine other people will be doing that work on my behalf, just so I can feel good about, you know, my mystical relationship with the organic fields. So I like him. He's a skeptic and a good writer.
And okay, so now that you've skewered the world of foodies, as you have, literally, what's your next target?
It's not like I go around looking for targets.
Isn't it?
Like a hunter in the world of ideas. Somebody did mention to me the other day I should write a book against literary festivals, but I thought that would rather be biting the hand that feeds me.
It would.
Then maybe I would get invited back, you know, for the shock value. You've all come to the literary festival, I'll tell you why you're an idiot. But no, I don't think I'm going to do that, but I don't have a strong idea of what the next thing will be. But, you know, follow me on Twitter and then you'll find out.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time together, just in time to start thinking about lunch. Very well-timed session. Please join me in thanking Steven Poole.
Thanks very much.